All right. Well, we're in our second time in Esther here. And why don't we start with a word of prayer. Let me pray. Lord, I pray that you would, as you've guided us, you would teach us, that your Holy Spirit would enlighten us, not only to the facts of this story, of this book, but also to its hidden elements. And open our eyes to that and show us how that's applied to our lives in this day that we live in. So we thank you for these things and pray in Christ's name. Amen. All right, so we got through the first 7 verses of Esther after I spent some time doing introduction and historical background, gave you kind of a flavor for who Xerxes was, and we talked quite a bit about why he had this 6-month big feast, and its purpose, of course, was to gain support and supplies and agreement about a second campaign against Greece, which of course occurred and didn't turn out too well for him. Okay? Now, let's read verses 8 through 12 and discuss what's going on. It says, "And the drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion, for so the king had given orders to each official of his household that he should do according to the desires of each person. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the place, which belonged to, of course, Xerxes. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with much wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, he must be a big guy, I think, okay, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass. He must be a dead guy.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking.
That's right. The 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and to the princes, for she was beautiful. Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became very angry, and his wrath burned within him." Now, Xerxes is known for his temperament. He's known for his temper. Matter of fact, when they start this war and they march all the way to this area called the Hellespont, which is this isthmus that connects essentially the Middle East with Europe. In other words, you go over the Hellespont and you're into Greece. So he makes these 2 pontoon bridges, and his engineers set them up, and they're ready to get this massive army across, and they don't work. Okay? So he's stuck there with this massive army, at first not being able to get across. So in his sage, calm way, he commands that all the engineers that were involved in the project be killed. Yeah, they're all killed. He then orders that the commanders of the troops take large chains and beat the Hellespont, the waters of the Hellespont there in the isthmus, to warn the waters, of course, of his great power and of his need to get across. True history. Herodotus tells us this. All right, so this is the guy we're talking about. I want to give you some of the historical flavor for the temperament. So when Vashti refuses, she is saying no to a tyrant. We need to understand that. And we're going to talk about that because I think it's a very interesting thing, and we'll talk about this. So after the 6-month feast, of course, he puts on the 7-day drunken feast. He suspends the usual rule that, quote, when the king drinks, everyone else drinks. He suspends that rule, which was a standard rule for his court. And of course, he lets them drink wine or whatever other substances, intoxicating substances. Herodotus tells us, the Greek historian Herodotus tells us, that it was believed by the Persians that by using wine and other substances, they could then bring themselves into closer proximity to the spiritual realm. Now, this is not unique to the Persians. It's really a very common belief held by many different cultures and practiced by many different cultures. Now, we have a New Testament example of it. If you will, turn to Galatians in the New Testament, chapter 5. So hold your place there, but turn all the way back past 1st and 2nd Corinthians to Galatians chapter 5. Okay? Starting in verse 19. It says, "Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, which are immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery," okay? Sorcery, this is the word we're going to look at. Then he says, enmity, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, and factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these, all of which I forewarn you, just as I have forewarned you, that all of those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. Okay? So there's a long list of problematic behaviors. But this one in verse 20, sorcery, is the word pharmakia. That's the word in the Greek.
Pharmacy.
Correct. But more than that. Pharmakia in the Greek implied the use of drugs in relationship to magical arts. That's what it implied. Now, let's look at another example of it. There's many examples of it.
I'm sorry, in Galatians, which word is that?
It's the word sorcery in verse 20.
Sorcery.
Okay? So turn further to your right to the book of Revelation. And go all the way almost to the end of chapter 18. And we're going to look in chapter 18 at verse 23. Okay? And let me start in 21. He's talking about this place or culture or environment or mentality, I think it's all of those, called Mystery Babylon. In other words, in the end, in the last 7 years, the elements of Babylon, with all of its sorcery, the Tower of Babel, Nimrod, the desire to congregate into great cities, the defiance of God, and all these things will be exemplified and magnified exponentially in this thing called Mystery Babylon. Okay? And there's a religious component of it, and there's also an economic component of it. And both of those are talked about in Revelation here. But in 20, so let me start at 21. "And a strong angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, Thus will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will not be found any longer." Then verse 22. "And the sound of harpists and musicians and flute players and trumpeters will not be heard in you any longer. And no craftsman of any craft will be found in you any longer. And the sound of a mill will not be heard in you any longer." Verse 23. "And the light of a lamp will not shine in you any longer. And the voice of the bridegroom and the bride will not be heard in you any longer. For your merchants were great men of the earth, because of all the nations because all the nations were deceived by your pharmakia, sorcery. Is it any wonder, as we are, I believe, approaching closer and closer to the end time, closer to the last 7-year period, is it any wonder that there's such an effort to spread and use all kinds of different drugs in our own culture? Okay, we now have the legalization, I believe, in 25 states, approximately, of marijuana. A lot of those states, it is approved for recreational usage. Some of those states allow it for medical usage, where it has to be licensed for its use. You have to give a diagnosis, etc. There's widespread use of drugs. We have a terrible fentanyl problem in this country, which comes across the southern border in droves of millions and millions and millions of tablets of fentanyl. We have an enormous amount of drug movement across our southern border, okay? And then it's dispersed all through the United States. We have enormous numbers of people addicted to heroin. We have enormous numbers of people that die from heroin, okay? We have the abuse of opioids that has become and is well known in the media, and they even call it an opioid crisis. And indeed it is an opioid crisis, okay? All of these things don't occur for no reason at all, okay? Go ahead, Anna.
So what, the word pharmakia, what exactly it means?
It means the use of chemicals, usually particularly plant chemicals, in relationship to magical, whether it's the practice of magic, making of spells. I mean, there's a long history. Go back to the Sibyls, the priestesses of the Greek oracle, okay, the Oracle Delphi and the other oracles. What did the Sibyls do? They used drugs, developed themselves into a euphoric state. They would then be taken over by a demon, and they would make forecasts. They were fortune tellers. They were mediums.
Well,
That's what they did.
It's still there. It's still there in many countries.
Oh, absolutely. Okay.
In big amount, yeah.
Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, and you just mentioned it there. Pharmakeia, in the original, it not only talks about an association with magic and magical arts, which is forbidden in Scripture, of course, but it also is a gateway to the demonic realm
Absolutely.
itself. Whether the people who use drugs understand that or not, the drugs themselves are a pathway to influence and in some cases domination by demons.
Absolutely. It weakens, if you want to use the word, and several people do, the quote curtain between this world and the spiritual realm. It makes more availability for access to the spiritual realm, to the spiritual entities, which of course are demonic entities in this case. So this is a problem that we see going on right now, and it's certainly accelerating. Now also, Herodotus tells us something about Vashti. Her name, of course, means beautiful. That's her name. And she was the daughter of Atanes, who was one of Xerxes' military commanders. Now, in rabbinic literature, the rabbis state in their sources that she was the granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And there's certainly evidence to that being true. We're not told in this text, but there's certainly other evidence, historical evidence, rabbinic evidence, that probably is the case. Now, Vashti, of course, as we see in these verses, has her own parallel party. She has a 7-day party for women, okay? And of course, part of the reason why this is true is that in Persian culture, in social occasions, men and women did not mingle. women had their own elements, their own parties, their own whatever, and men had their own. It's much like the Middle East today. It's much like what goes on in Islam. Okay? There's a male-dominated, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, very patriarchal system. And of course, women do not have equality in that system in any way, shape, or form. And of course, this is what she was doing. She was practicing the Persian culture in this sense. Now, in her refusal to come as she was summoned, of course, she sets a dangerous response towards Xerxes, who of course is a potentially dangerous person in any setting whatsoever. And of course, he predictably becomes furious. All right?
How dare you?
How dare you? You know, he really saw himself very much as the god, the king of the world, and certainly had a large empire to, quote, demonstrate that. By the way, if you want to see an interesting movie, we saw it not too long ago, that talks about this era, go and see the movie called 300. Have you ever seen it? It's a great movie.
The military battles are
Yes.
actually quite accurate.
Yeah, it's of course, it's when Persians, Xerxes is the leader. It's the story of Xerxes invading Greece, Sparta, one of the city-states. And there's a lot of historical accuracy in it. It's a very interesting movie if you want to kind of see what is demonstrated. It shows the massive army of Persia, and indeed, it was huge. It was huge. So, let's read verses 13 through 18 in chapter 1.
By the way, their king was portrayed almost like a giant, remember?
He was. It's interesting they portrayed him that
Yeah.
way in that movie. You know, we don't know. I don't know historically whether there's accuracy to that or not. But in this movie, Xerxes is portrayed as a giant. He's huge. I'd have to look through that and see if there's any evidence whatsoever there. I don't know. It's interesting that they portrayed him that way, though. So, let's read 13 through 18. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for it was the custom of the king so to speak before all who knew law and justice. And there close to him were Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, Mamukan, that is the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom. According to law, what should be done with Queen Vashti, because she did not obey the command of the king delivered by the eunuchs. And in the presence of the king and the princes, Mamukan said, quote, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all of the princes and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of the king. That is, he says she's offended and created a problem for it kingdom-wide. 127 satraps. In his view, she's created a problem in all of them. Verse 17. For the queen's conduct will become known to all, the woman causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, quote, the Queen Vashti, or the king commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in his presence, but she did not come. Verse 18, and this day the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's conduct will speak in the same way to all the king's princes, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger.
Yeah.
All right? Now, these are very provocative and interesting statements that are made here by him. So, interestingly, Xerxes does something, if you look at the text, and it's a lot easier in the Hebrew, but he first seeks advice of his, quote, wise men. who, quote, understand the times. That's who he seeks first. Now, that is the word katam, wise men, and it means skillful, crafty, intelligent men, well-trained, and used as enchanters and magicians. That's who he applies to. We see evidence of them in a book that we've studied quite a while ago. Let's look. Turn to your right. Keep your place there, Ness, but turn to your right to the book of Daniel. It's a very interesting potential connection here that I find fascinating. I'm not going to go into all of it, but as a matter of fact, in Daniel, if you want to look in Daniel 4, where it says in verse 9, we're going to go to 5 also, but if you go to Daniel 4, verse 9, he says, "Oh, Belteshazzar, chief of the musicians," that is, Rob Kartam. That's the word. Rob Kartam. And then if you go to chapter 5, okay, we want to look here at verse 11. "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him." He's speaking of Daniel here. Okay? He says, "And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king appointed him chief of the Kartam, magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners." Now, if you remember, and I've talked about this before, these guys did a bunch of different things, but one large element is that they were astronomers and astrologers, both. They studied the movements of the heavens, they studied the movements of the planets, they studied the movements of the moons that they could detect. They studied all of these things, the declination cycle, 18.5-year declination cycle of the moon. They charted these things. We certainly have those charts as records. These are the people. Now, Daniel is the head of all of them during Nebuchadnezzar's reign and also during Cyrus's reign. Remember, the Persians take over in almost a bloodless coup.
Yeah.
Right? You remember? They go down, they make it so that they can wade underneath in the Euphrates and go under the gates of Babylon, come into the city and capture it almost without any bloodshed in a night. Literally, in a night. So all of a sudden, Cyrus takes over Babylon. But he keeps Daniel. Okay, because he sees the wisdom of Daniel, the history of Daniel. And so Daniel is the one that directed all these people. And it's again, as we've talked about it during Christmas time, it's the reason why the Magi, who are Persians,
Showed up.
are able to see the star, know where to go, and show up to see the Christ child. It's all because of Daniel and how he taught them.
Now, this in the book of Esther, the same guys?
We don't know what's happened between 539 and 465, 80 or so years. We don't know what's happened to them because obviously Daniel must have died not too long after 539
They're
BC.
keeping the same tradition.
They're keeping the same tradition.
Okay.
And there's probably undoubtedly elements of what Daniel's taught them that remain and are being taught and passed down. Otherwise, why would they go and look for the star of the king of the Jews? Why would they know the place? Why would they know the date, etc.? So
Daniel must have had a huge conflict.
it's very interesting when you look at the life of Daniel. We've studied him. We did the book of Daniel, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. It's a fascinating book, but he dealt with all of these occult individuals. He dealt with occult arts. He dealt with occult science as a believer in God, and somehow managed to work with them, even though it was absolutely, in its base, a satanic system. I mean, talk about somebody that works in the system. Daniel worked in the system and kept his integrity all through all of it. He was a remarkable person. Now,
No wonder he prayed 3 times.
yeah, absolutely. He needed to. So these Khartam, it says, were familiar with the times. Now, the thing that I think is being said here in this verse is that Vashti's refusal, there was a question whether it was prophetically significant event. Otherwise, why would he first go to them and ask them what's going on?
So does that indicate that women just, they were totally and completely like in obedience?
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Some of the things we know about how women were dealt with in Middle Eastern custom. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So I think that it's very possible that what he was asking them is if they had any prophetic insight whether there was going to be a coup. Now, you could say, well, that's kind of paranoid. Well, if you look at the history of what happens, all right, 20-some years later, there is a coup. And Xerxes is killed by one of his commanders. And he dies through an assassination. So a coup does occur, but it isn't right now, and it isn't caused by Vashti. So, he also then, secondly, notice, he seeks the legal counselors. All you lawyers here, okay? All right? He seeks them, he asks them see if there's any legal precedent in this huge volume of Persian law, because Persian law, and we have lots of copies of it, was a vast volumes of law that was imprinted on clay tablets and stored in libraries.
They were very meticulous.
Yes, they were very meticulous, and the rule of Persian law is once a law was made, you could not violate it. It was immutable. Done.
Like forever? Or till the next king comes?
Supposedly immutable. That's why they studied the law all the time, because they wanted to know what others had done.
And the kings of Medo-Persia were also subject to that law.
Yes, they were. Everyone was. Everyone was. So, no one could violate the law. They had to study it, understand it, because no one could violate it.
Oh, that's why Esther knew that if she shows up, she'll be killed. It's because that was the law.
If he chose to, right?
If he chose to,
he
yes.
chose to,
Yeah. You're jumping ahead here. Okay. So then he seeks advice and discussion, then next, you'll notice, with his 7 most powerful political leaders, who obviously rule over these 127 provinces. All of this done to ask, what shall we do with Queen Vashti? It's amazing. The effort that's put into this. This becomes an enormous scandal. Absolutely enormous scandal. Now, I don't think there's any evidence in the text that tells us that Vashti somehow was trying to lead a coup, a revolution, or a movement. I'm sorry if you want to find a women's movement political agenda here in these verses, which some have done, if you look at some of the liberal commentators, okay? But I don't think there's anything in the text that tells us that at all.
But she was the first feminist?
No, I don't think she was.
Well,
Okay.
I've also heard that she perhaps, no evidence, but perhaps was pregnant and was not.
You're jumping ahead.
She just stole my information. There you go again. All right.
You're gonna have to
Very
speed it up a
good.
little bit.
Very good. And I think you're exactly right. Okay? Now, understand that she was simply doing what the cultural norm was requiring of women. Okay? She was asked to do something that was not normal. Okay? I think that, number one, it violated Persian principle and culture to call her into this boys club, which is really what it was, a drunken boys club, okay? Secondly, I think probably she didn't want to be disrespected. She was queen. Now, what was she being asked to do? To dress up,
Maybe dance.
who knows, but put her crown on, it says, and go to the boys club. And certainly, I don't think there's any question that these drunken revelers are going to be gawking at her because she's called beautiful to do this. And I think she simply doesn't want to do that. It's a disgrace to her. It's wrong to her, you know, and I think she just doesn't want to be disrespected that way. I think that's really what her main motivation was. Now, we see that one of the princes, his name is Memucan, he then concludes that Vashti has offended A, the king, B, the 7 princes, and all the peoples, and I really think you're going to clearly see that really means all the men, okay, of Persian society, the Persian realm. All right? Now, in the ancient world, women were used as slaves. They were considered often personal property. They were, and of course, they were, in many cultural traditions, they were bound by the rule and the words and the decisions of their own husbands. Now, this is the concept that we call patriarchy. That's the word sociologically we used, and the Persian Empire was built on a patriarchal system. It's not the only one that was built on a patriarchal system, but certainly it was. Fathers ruled and controlled unmarried sons and daughters. And this was also true, to a certain extent, also in Israel. Hold your place in Esther, but turn to Exodus chapter 21. And we're going to look at verse 7. And if a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not to go free as the male slaves do. Now there's a nice law there. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. In other words, there was a price set. She could be bought back from her family for this price. That's the redemption of a slave. It says he does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. And if he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. And if he takes to himself any woman, he may not reduce her food or clothing or conjugal rights, and it goes on and on. Okay, in Israel, you could sell your daughter to pay your debt for a period, for an amount, but there are all these conditions about how she was to be treated in the process. Okay, but it could be done. So, in the same way, Israel followed, in this sense, during this time, the cultural norm of many Middle Eastern societies. You'll find all through the... Do you want to say something, Ashka?
Question.
Yes.
So if woman was created as a helper and a partner for
Yes.
a man, then why God made this kind of law to people?
I think he made it to regulate what was already a sinful situation that was going on, and to put some constraints around it.
So until the New Testament, when Jesus put
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
It's interesting, of course, that the Old Testament, certainly in many passages, does not outlaw slavery. which of course in today's culture right now with what's going on, you know, would be, a
Question.
horrible thing to say. But it's true. But it's no different than the other Middle Eastern cultures, with the exception that the Jews, by the law, had very specific constraints that were put on the ability to make a slave, to sell a slave, to use slave labor. Remember, if you bought a slave and it was 2 years before Jubilee year, you're only going to have him for 2 years.
Okay, but.
Because at the Jubilee, every slave was free.
Except it said there, women weren't.
No, I think they were all
Oh,
slaves.
and
All
Jubilee.
slaves. At Jubilee, all slaves were free.
Okay,
All property goes back to its original owners, etc.
But
okay.
the role of a woman or women in the Bible is very significant. It just, hello.
Yeah, it is.
Right? And yet they could like sell their daughters.
Yes. Yeah. Obviously, when you look at the intention, and you mentioned it, Genesis 3, and you look at the creation of Adam and Eve, it is as clear as could be that they were co-equal, different, but meant to interact in a personal, sexual, emotional way with each other, but equal.
Right.
Okay? I have to say it, I'm sorry, bear with me, but our very wise Supreme Court this week decided in its great wisdom that there's now apparently a third gender. That it decided that transgendered individuals, those that have had transgender surgery and identify as transgender, are now protected under the law. Okay? This is going to create, in my opinion, a horrendous situation in this country. As a result, they've opened up a can of worms that I think they have no idea what's going to come out of it. One of the things, among many things, that's going to come out of it, and if you want, there's a lot, but one thing that's going to come out is this is the end, in my opinion, of women's sports.
Yeah,
Done.
right.
You will never have a normal women's sports anymore. Because when you look at what's been happening already, transgendered men to women have entered into all kinds of women's sports. And of course, guess what happens?
They win.
They win. So biological women are now made a secondary class because of this ruling. Isn't it interesting? They have now taken a second spot, and they will probably never be able to accomplish, athletically what the transgendered female does. These are the things that when you change the design directive in Genesis 3, you come up with horrid things down the line. And this is one of many that will occur, I predict. So, go ahead. You want to say something?
No, you were saying.
You just want me to stop, okay? I will pontificate no more at this moment.
Exactly.
But notice, currently in the Middle East, we have exactly the same situation. In Islam, we have exactly the same situation in terms of the status of women. You go across the countries of many countries in Africa, you have exactly the same status of women. And in Asia, and we were even talking today, the other day, with one of my wife's friends named Vadim, who lives in Shanghai, China, and we were asking him because he knows Chinese culture very well, and apparently, and honey, you want to say it so I don't say it wrong, there's still this principle that's frequently used in China where the father arranges a marriage of his choice, often for economic reasons, for his daughter.
Yeah, father or parents.
Yeah.
Together. And woman is traditionally,
Yes. So you have a huge percentage of the globe still practicing under these principles. It's tragic. in my opinion, that it's true. It's not God's original design, but in the fall of man, everything becomes subject to chaos and misery. And this is just one more example of it. So we have it, but it's a patriarchal system. And certainly in Persia, there was this patriarchal system. Now it says that the fear was that women would, quote, look with contempt at their husbands. Look at contempt. The word in Hebrew means to look in the eyes, to convey through a facial expression, that is, look at. The word contempt is the word baza, and it means to despise, to disdain, to look down upon, to disrespect, to loathe, to cause willful disobedience. This is what they were fearing was going to occur virtually, what they're saying, in every man's household because of what Vashti has done. I personally think this is probably preposterous. They are making a huge deal out of this situation, but that's their fear.
Well, he was angry.
He was angry.
He was drunk.
Okay? So, right, and he was drunk too.
Yeah,
Very good. That's true.
his ego was stabbed.
It was, absolutely. His ego was stabbed. And of course, this is seen as a threat to their positions and loss of control over their wives. And therefore, they need to make Vashti as an example so that no woman would dare to do this dangerous experiment again. That's really what they're saying here, and it's what they're doing here as they make this law. Now, it's interesting that patriarchy has spread in many cultures, in many millennia. We see it in this country as being part of what was behind the use of black slaves. Okay? It was a patriarchal system. We see that it also, once slaves were freed and given the right even to vote, it was a patriarchal system called the Ku Klux Klan. It was used to suppress black vote. I will tell you this, the party, I'm sorry, but I'm going to say it, the party in this country that made great efforts to suppress black vote were the Democrats. Because the Republican Party didn't exist before 1860. It was the Democratic Party that was behind this, and I think it's quite ironic what they claim to be the champion of at this point in our country. Now, we see also the effort of a patriarchal system limiting women going through the 18th and 19th centuries, especially limiting them in efforts for higher education. It was difficult often during those times as a woman to get the amount of education that she wanted to get. She was not treated as a co-equal. So we see here that although some people claim that these things are institutional failure and that all the institutions of society need to be changed as a result. That's what we're seeing in this country right now. The desire to remake the institutions of the United States of America. But according to the Bible, it's not primarily institutional failure. It's primarily a failure of the human heart.
It's sin.
It's a failure of human beings that would dehumanize and disrespect other human beings. That's the cause of it. And I'm telling you, no law will ever change that.
That's right.
No matter what law you make, no matter what codes you make, no matter what policies you make, no matter how you want to turn the United States upside down, or any culture, we're just seeing it here, it will not change the sinful nature of the human heart. One bit.
You can't legislate morality.
No, you can't legislate morality. You can't legislate it. So, clearly, the Bible says in the New Testament that we are all co-equals, slave or free, black and white, male and female, that everyone is supposed to be treated with the utmost respect because they're made in the image of God.
Correct.
That's the reason. That's the motivation. That's why you shouldn't be a racist. Because you see another human being and you believe that you should treat him the way his father and his designer and his Lord would treat him.
That's right.
That's why we should treat people the way we should treat them, with respect and kindness and dignity.
Right.
But that idea seemingly has been lost on our culture in this country now. You know? I want to show, just as an example of it, so you know some New Testament references. Turn to the book of James, all the way back past Hebrews. And we're going to go to chapter 2. James was addressing this very issue in the New Testament, starting at verse 1. My brethren, don't hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. Could it be more clear? You're not to make favorites in any way, shape, or form. You're to treat people equally. Now here's the example of what was going on in this church group. Verse 2. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who's wearing the fine clothes, and you say, sit here in a good place. And you say to the poor man, stand over there or sit down by my footstool. Now this goes on. I mean, doesn't this describe Washington, D.C. to you?
Yep.
Doesn't it? You know, you have to have a special place, a special position, a special honor. You have to have a special, you have to have people that pay money, for special favors in Congress.
Well, it's a celebrity concept.
Absolutely, it is the celebrity concept, and you have it in Hollywood, but you have it in Washington, D.C. in spades. These are the people that are telling us that we are racially motivated in how we treat people, and yet what do they do all the time? They live by the celebrity status, constantly. They are hypocrites. Can I make it more clear?
They have walls around their place.
Yes.
Yeah.
They talk about the fact that everyone's equal and you should never discriminate, but you look at the houses they live in.
Yeah.
You look at the protection system that they have. They'll talk endlessly about there should be the end of the Second Amendment and people should not have right to guns, except who do they hire to protect them? People with guns. Okay? So they're hypocrites. They don't live by what they say. And this is exactly what James says we should not do. Verse 4, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? You're judging people. You're making decisions about their value and worth as human beings. James says that's terrible to do. Listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he promised to those who love him? In other words, where do you think this is all going to end up, guys, with the fancy clothes and the gold rings? Ain't going to matter a squat in the kingdom of heaven. And it sure doesn't impress God whatsoever, right? Isn't that what he's saying?
Luke 16.
Yeah, Luke 16 about Abraham's bosom.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Lazarus, the poor man, and the rich man. Verse 6, but you have dishonored the poor man. Is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into court? I think of that verse and the meaning of it, even in today's culture. Okay? Who's the person that dishonors you? Who's the person that ends up with a lawsuit against you? Who's the person that wants to take your property? Who's the person that wants to take your constitutional rights from you? It's not the poor man. It's the rich man that has the means and the power and the money to do it. Yeah, and say it. Go ahead. George Soros and others like him. You know, he dishonors the average person by what he does, by trying to create a revolution, and in doing so, pitting person against person. Never forget that what's going on in this society right now is a grand effort to pit people against each other. And that's how they think they will make a revolution and win. That's how they think it will happen. And our response as Christians should be, I honor you and I respect you and I love you because you're made in the image of God. And I don't look at your skin. I don't look at the slant in your eyes if you have Asian descent. I don't look at the color of your skin. I don't look at where you were born. I don't look at your background. I don't look at your ancestry. It doesn't matter to me. Okay? You are God's child. That's what matters. And if we would treat people that way, and if the church would become serious about doing it, which they're not, because the major part of the church, that is the progressive church, is taking up the social gospel and the social fairness and the social justice movement. And they're doing exactly what these non-Christian political morons are doing too. They're not doing what God said to do in reality.
They
Okay?
can split hairs over the darn.
Absolutely.
Really?
Hey, Tim,
Yes.
you left out one entity that is a driver.
Okay?
That's the press,
Oh, absolutely.
the media.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Oh, yeah.
Norman, we
If
were...
you eliminate that, you've eliminated a lot of the kerosene on the fire.
Yeah. You know, Norman, last night my wife and I watched a movie. What was the name of it?
The Post.
The Post. Have you ever seen it? It
Yeah,
starred, honey, it starred
What?
the man,
Oh, Tom Hanks?
Tom Hanks,
And
okay?
Meryl
And
Streep.
Meryl Streep.
yeah, that's stupid.
Now, it's really a good movie. What it was about, of course, is uncovering all the documents that the government had collected all through the years about the Vietnam War, and a person inside with inside information got a hold of these secret documents and released them to the press. And of course, this was during the Nixon administration, and it made one big blow up to occur. But the thing that impressed me is looking at how the press, as the third rail of the culture, the way it was meant to do, researched and documented and bulldogged this thing to seek out the truth.
Right.
That idea about journalism is dead, gone and buried somewhere in schools of journalism in this country. They don't seek the truth, as Norman is saying. They have become propagandists. They seek to espouse ideologies, and therefore they seek to support the ideology that they believe in. Never think they're anything but propagandists, because they are. It's sad. That's not the way they were meant to be, but that's what they've become. Okay? Now, Norman started me. Okay?
Nothing unusual, Tim.
That's right. That's right. It's Norman's fault.
Welcome to Chekhov.
Okay? Now, so let's go ahead and read now the last verses. We'll end the chapter here. And that's verses 19,
Yes,
back in Esther, verses 19 through 22. Let me go back. I'm still in James, so here, back Esther. So it says, starting verse 19, if it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed. That's Persian law. That Vashti should come no more into the presence of the king, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. Which is a very important statement, because that's going to be the essence of the rest of this book. Okay? Verse 20, and when the king's edict which he shall make is heard throughout all his kingdom, great as it is, then all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. And this word pleased the king and also the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, and to every people according to their language. Remember, there isn't one language there. This is a huge kingdom, so it's got all these different subcultures in it that also have their own languages. But it was translated into all of their languages. That every man should be the master in his own house, and the one who speaks in the language of his own people. Now, let's take these last verses.
Hey, Tim, can I insert something in there?
Yes.
What you just read is the doctrine in the Book of Mormon.
That's interesting. You're right. You're right.
If what you read is the exact item in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, that's good to point that out. Yeah, you're right.
I've read.
Yeah, I mean, you read the Book of Mormon and you'll find that in there. Absolutely
Yes.
true.
There's all kinds of insane stuff.
Yeah, there is.
too.
Now, so what it said here in these verses is that they agreed to make this law, an edict. Okay? We see the word edict used 8 times in this book of Esther. It's a theme of the book of Esther, edicts. It was made that Vashti be deposed and that another queen be found. And as I said, therefore, entree, Esther. Now we have the rest of the story, as used to be said. Okay? And a law made for the whole kingdom that women of every culture and socioeconomic group will honor their husbands. Well, there's nothing wrong with honoring your husband, but I don't know how you're going to make a law to accomplish it, in all honesty. Because again, it's an attitude of the heart. It's an attitude that when the husband treats his wife the way she should be treated, with kindness and honor and respect and love, then the proper response of the wife to that treatment should be respect. That's the way it naturally goes. That's the way God designed it to be. And that's the way, and it's the only way it truly works.
That's true.
Okay?
Their
Now-
husbands have to earn that respect.
That's true. It is true. So here's the question.
It's a good point then.
And this is where Anne got ahead of us. Being the student that she is. But here's the question. And you should be, thank you. You should be asking yourself this question when you read these verses as a good student of the Bible. Remember, whenever you read a verse and see something in it, always ask why. Why? Why is it here? Why is it said this way? Why is it put here? You're going to learn a great amount if you just ask the question why. So, why was she deposed but not executed? As mad and angry and totalitarian and dictatorial person as Xerxes I was, why didn't he execute her? So, I did a little math here. Okay?
Oh, there we go.
I did a little math. So here's the math. The historian Thucydides writes that Artaxerxes, the son of Xerxes I, okay, came to the throne of his father in 464 BC. Why? Because his father was assassinated in 465 BC. That's why. Now, Xerxes died from this assassination, as I said, in 465. It's stated that Artaxerxes, his son, was 19 years old when he took the throne. Thus, he was born in 483 BC. these events that we're reading, it states right in the first chapter, occurred in the 3rd year of Xerxes' reign, which is 483 BC. Therefore, I agree with Anne. The reason why I think Vashti was not killed is because she was pregnant with his son. Now, even more so, there's a reason God intervened here, I believe. And I believe God absolutely intervened in this situation. And I'll tell you why he intervened. Okay? Now, Artaxerxes does something very important in Jewish history. Let's go back one book to the book of Nehemiah. And we're going to go to chapter 2. And we're going to read a very, very interesting set of verses in Nehemiah chapter 2. Starting in verse 1. This is the biblical record, which is also documented in other ancient history. It's the same history that the Persians document. It just happens that it's recorded here in the scriptures. Verse 1, starting. And it came about in the month of Nisan, that is March, April, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, okay, remember, King Artaxerxes, the son of Xerxes, reign, that wine was set before him, that's common in Persia, and it was given to the king. Now, I had not been sad in his presence. This is Nehemiah speaking. Now remember what Nehemiah is. He's a cupbearer to the king.
Oh, that's right.
Therefore, every time the king is ready to drink wine, what is Nehemiah going to do?
Taste it first.
Taste it first so that it proves it's not poisoned. So there's not an assassination through food. So the king looked and said to me, why is your face sad though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid. In other words, the king is looking at him and saying, you're not a happy camper here. And let me assure you, in the Persian realm and in the court of the Persian kings, you were supposed to be a happy camper. Okay? They did not like negative people, in the court. So, verse 3, and I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my fathers' tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire? What's he saying? I'm sad because Jerusalem is still ruined.
Torn up, yeah.
Right, that's what he's saying. Verse 4, then the king said to me, what would you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Now here's a quick but important prayer. Okay? It proves that quickie prayers are not wrong, though they shouldn't be the standard by which we pray, but Nehemiah has one right here. He has a quickie prayer, okay? And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, verse 5, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Verse 6, and then the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will your journey be, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that is beyond the Euphrates, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. Verse 8, in a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress, which is by the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I will go. And the king granted them to me, because the good hand of my God was on me. Now, why is this so important? Well, we know when this decree occurred. It happened in 444 BC. That's when he made this edict that the Jews could rebuild Jerusalem and its walls, which in Daniel chapter 9 is the timing event which sets off the time clock which starts the 70 week of years prophecy. So if Xerxes would have been killed in the womb because of his mother being dying, then who would have issued this decree that started God's time clock for all of prophecy to occur and be summed up?
So God
Wouldn't have.
predestined him for that purpose.
For God predestined Artaxerxes for this purpose. Absolutely.
Okay.
That's why this happened the way it occurred.
Wow.
Now did Cyrus let Ezra go back?
Yes, I did. Now I want you to notice an interesting thing in verse 22 of back again to Esther, chapter 1. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces. Now, it's interesting. We know from historical records that the Persians had a remarkable mail system, that they built outposts and supply stations that were at a maximum of 20 miles from each other, all through the kingdom. So they would take the edicts written on clay tablets, and they would have a messenger pass them. And in a matter of weeks, they could reach the furthermost edges of the Persian Empire.
Wow.
It reminds us of something in history in this country, don't you think?
Yes.
The Pony Express, which I believe personally was built on the same concept. Okay? Because they were 10 to 20 mile outposts where a rider would transfer to a new rider, and you could get it across the country apparently in about 10 to 12 days that way. So I think it was just a model of the Persian system.
It also had to do with the mode of transportation, the type of horses they had available.
It's true. They kept a unique horses, uniquely cared for, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want to say one last thing to close. The rabbis describe the book of Esther in their rabbinic literature by this term. They call it Hester Panim. Hester Panim. It means to hide the face. To hide the face. What is Esther's word, what does her name mean in Hebrew?
Hidden or hiding.
Hidden.
Hidden.
That's what her name means in Hebrew. Now, the rabbis claim that the word hidden, or the reference to the word hidden, in the book of Esther is actually hidden and found in the Torah. It's found, they claim, in Deuteronomy 31.
Okay, say that again, please.
The rabbis claim that Esther, in her name, even numerically what it means, is actually hidden in the Torah.
Okay.
And we're going to let's go to the verse. Let's go to Deuteronomy 31.
Okay.
This is the verse they pick. And it's verse 18. 31.
Oh, 30.
31, Deuteronomy 31. Surely I will hide my face, that's the word in Hebrew, in that day because of all the evil which they do, for they will turn to other gods. Now, I'll show you how I think this applies, and I personally believe the rabbis are right about this. I will surely hide my face. This is said of the Persian Jews because what did they do? In 539 BC, Cyrus comes to power, takes over Babylon, and issues a decree. What does he say to the Jews?
Go back.
You can go back to Israel. Right? and he issues an edict. And so about 50,000 of them go. But that's a small percentage. There probably were hundreds of thousands of them, if not a few million of them, all across what is the Persian Empire. So this small contingent goes back to Israel, then this huge amount of them don't. Okay? You see what the verse says in Deuteronomy? I will surely hide my face in that day because of all the evil which they will do, for they'll turn to other gods. So what is it that happens to the Jews in Persia? Do they follow kosher? Do they read? Do they read? The Torah? Do they study these things? Do they practice the 7 festivals? No, we read none of this. None of it. They are secularized Jews living in Persia. That's what they become.
It's still that way today, Tim.
It is, absolutely.
It's still that way today. Hadn't changed.
So they, that is the Jews that don't go, choose to hide their faces, as it were, by not returning to Israel. And they end up living in this pagan culture, which, of course, its traditions influence them. And it's why, undoubtedly, in the book of Esther, there's no reference to the name of God. Because these were purely secularized Jews that were living during this time. Now, there's another interesting verse, I think, that uses these same words that we talked about. And I want to show it to you. Go to Genesis 32. Genesis 32. And I want you to look at verse 30. This is a story about Jacob. This is when he wrestles with who?
God.
Probably the angel of the Lord. The second person, Jesus, the pre-incarnate Christ. And then he says in 29, then Jacob asked him and said, please tell me your name. And he said, why is it that you ask my name? So Jacob named the place Peniel, which means I have seen the face of God. Okay?
And not die.
And not died. My life has been preserved. Jacob saw the face of God. But the Jews turned away, so God hid their face from them. Interestingly, if you look at the Hebrew text, it says that Vashti won't li paneh. She won't show her face to Xerxes. But then, in Esther 8:4, it says that Esther dares to li paneh, show her face to Xerxes to ask for the preservation of the Jews. 2 women doing different things, but the grammar in the Hebrew is exactly the same.
Okay.
Interesting, isn't it? Now there's other references to other verb forms, other words of panah or panim. If you want to look at them, we're not going to necessarily look at them right now, but if you want references to them, you can see them in Psalm 25:16, Psalm 34:16, Psalm 119, verse 132, and verse 135, and Lamentations 4:16. All use this same word about the face of God, being hidden from the face of God. Okay? So, why don't we stop for tonight? And I wonder if, Jack, would you be willing to close this in prayer?
Heavenly Father, thank you for the privilege of being able to meet together, to learn your word, and to get a better understanding of what you're trying to tell us through your holy word. We thank you for the privilege of having the freedom to study your word. We thank you for the wisdom and the teaching that Tim has done to help us to prepare, to learn about your word, things that we never would know on ourselves and have not had the training and the time to study these. We ask that you go with us each day and give us the ability to make wise decisions and follow your word, and that we may lead lives that are pleasing to you. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Thank you.